Welcome to episode 86 of Live with the Maverick. My name is Dominic Lee, founder of Maverick Actuary. We are a content community. Our mission is to maximize the impact and value of quant professionals on a global scale. The goal of this series is to educate our community on the most relevant themes in actuarial science, risk management, and analytics. The theme of today's discussion is actuarial careers. And we are very excited to have with us our guest for today's episode, 𝗟𝗃𝗃. Anne is Chief Risk Officer at Zurich North America, one of the largest providers of insurance solutions and services for businesses and individuals. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
We're very excited to have you, and again, congratulations on your role. I know it's still fairly new. I mean,
It's still fairly new, still in the first 90 days, yeah.
Yes, I was excited. I remember the CAS posted about that on LinkedIn, so that was nice to see. Well, love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah. So again, super excited to be here. I've been a long-time fan, so I think this is really good work, Dominic, that you're doing to kind of showcase different profiles and different professions in this arena. I think your work highlights the importance of just kind of talking about different career paths, right, and different things we're working on. It also highlights that we have a lot in common, right? Our problems are not in a silo, and I think our solutions come with collaboration as well. So a little bit about myself. I went to the University of Michigan, so I'm a proud Wolverine. And I started my career about 20 years ago, dating myself at CNA Insurance, PNC Actuary, kind of went through my exams there, my actuarial exams there, was an actuary in a variety of functions, pricing, reserving. And then around 2010, I joined Zurich in North America in Schaumburg here. And here I've had, as an actuary, I was in actuarial ops and had a variety of experiences in actuarial that we'll get into, and then moved to a finance role, and then now most recently here. So a bit of a standard actuarial path, but also most recently taking different roles outside of actuarial as well. Let's see, I've lived in Chicago for the last 20 years. It's getting warmer, which is nice for me personally. And yeah, so I have my family. I have 3 kids in a variety of ages. I spend most of my weekends shuffling them around from place to place. And then I think we're a pretty active family. We like to do some things outside. I like gardening. We take time to enjoy the outdoors. We play some tennis pretty badly, but yeah, so it's kind of that typical suburban American life.
Hey, as long as you enjoy it, and Chicago is a wonderful city, and well, you know this. I was there a couple of weeks ago, so
Yeah. Well,
love
it's
Chicago.
getting nicer. It's getting nicer. I would say March is probably the longest month of winter in Chicago. People think it's spring. It's not typically spring, but around May it gets really nice, and then it's beautiful in the summer. So
I will be not too far from there this weekend. I'm heading back to my alma mater, University of Nebraska, Lincoln. So I'm
oh, nice.
so keeping my fingers crossed for not too cold weather, which I
Yeah,
think it should be fine.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things you mentioned, which we certainly have in common, well, I mean, I'm in a non-traditional role now, but
Mm-hmm.
something I'm passionate about is like you've had several non-traditional roles in your career, and I'm,
Mm-hmm.
excited to explore those in a bit more detail, to drill down a bit more detail. So, what were some of your most notable non-traditional roles, and what are some of the business problems that you're trying to solve in those roles?
Yeah. So, I think as I look around at my non-traditional roles, right? So a couple, within actuarial that aren't your typical pricing, reserving, yeah, modeling roles. So, and I can talk a little bit more detail about each of them. It's I was in actuarial operations for a while. I was actuarial chief of staff, and then I was an actual business partner. So the commonality there is it's a very sort of lateral kind of role, right? Where you're looking across many different types of activities, many types of functions, and you're kind of cohesively thinking, holistically thinking across whether it's operations, whether it's people, right? Whether it's business. And that's appealed to me, right? Which is just the breadth and the different types of problems you're solving. But thematically, they all kind of make sense in that sometimes when we're really focused on our individual specific tasks and activities, right, we have missed gaps or have a need, right, for someone to kind of look at it broadly across the organization to make sure that we're strategically aligned to whatever guiding principle, right? So I'll kind of start with my actuarial ops role. So that's the role I started when I was in Zurich, and it was at the time, the actual function here was going through a lot of change, right? And we formed this function to tackle some non-standard problems, business problems, whether it's a peer review, whether it's a sort of a push to implement a system or a process, right? That doesn't fit neatly in our traditional actuarial competencies, which at the time was transactional pricing, what we call line of business pricing, which is tools and models, reserving, right? And so that was a really great role for me to join Zurich with, because it gave me a lot of visibility in terms of what were our systems and processes, right? How did we acquire data? How do we rationalize data? How do we store data? How do we analyze data? And then around also just great visibility into how do we interact and collaborate with others, right? So with IT, right, with our data management organization, with our products organization, right? And you see that when faced with these pretty complex organizational issues or problems, it takes multidisciplinary collaboration, right, within and outside of actuarial to solve them. So one of the biggest pieces of work that we did there was really around implementing our first data visualization framework, right? So this is, I'm dating myself, so this is like, 2000, maybe 2012, 2013, right? Where we were looking at, so we didn't have like the really well constructed Power BI dashboards as we do now, right? We were really transforming something that everybody was really working out of pivot tables, right? Pivot tables, Excel charts, right? And then we had this need of better understanding our data through visualization, right? So it was really looking at the different tools that we had. We had Tableau, we had 𝗟𝗪𝗃 at one point, right? And now we have Power BI, looking at the pros and the cons, making sure that then our data was structured in a way that can be readily absorbed, right, and processed within these displays and visualizations. So I think that was a really good, project for us to embark on. Again, spanning multiple disciplines within actuarial and outside. And then, so from there, I moved on from the process side to the people side, right? So we have people, process, and operations. And so I took on a role as actuarial chief of staff and supporting our chief actuary at the time. And my responsibilities was really around, we have these different departments within actuarial, right? Again, reserving, pricing, transactional pricing, modeling. How do we get them to work together? How do we optimize the remit, right? The objectives and the functions of these different areas. I spent a lot of time thinking about and working on talent, right? How do we recruit, develop, retain the right talent? How do we develop a pipeline that is from university, right, high school to university to actuarial student. How do we develop a robust, competitive student study program and a rotation program that makes sure that our talent pipeline then is robust and filled with actuaries who are curious, right, about the variety of either the businesses that we have at Zurich and the variety of opportunities that an actual career can provide. And then really thinking through, again, operationally, right, what are forums where the actuaries can gather and share ideas, share solutions, right, and share and debate on the various outlooks that we have, from on our business performance, right? I think it's really interesting, pricing has a little bit of an emerging view, whereas reserving has more of a robust hindsight view, right? One has maybe a bit more of a forecasting perspective, a bit less data, right? One has much more robust claims data, but that may or may not be relevant given the changes in direction tactically, strategically, right? And what we found is that the more the actuaries got together and talked about among not only ourselves, right, but also with the businesses, right, the deeper and more nuanced understanding we had, right, of our own work, right, and of how our work impacts others. So then it was actually quite organic then for me to move on. So I did operations, people, and then to business partnering, right? So from there, I managed a team of, we had actuarial planning, performance, but we were really a group of people that were business partners, right, to the various business units. So at Zurich North America, we have at the time, we have right now 8 business units, right, and many what we call sub business units, right. So they are laid out like middle markets and large accounts, right. Similar, I'm sure, to our competitors and contemporaries, and we have a business unit that is crop insurance, right. We have a business unit that is warranty and supports our automotive dealerships. We have a life, accident, and health business unit. Each of these business units share challenges, right, in terms of the marketplace, but also have unique tactics and ambitions, right, and some unique challenges as well. So my team, we were really the conduit of the actuarial, what we call Center of Excellence, or the actuarial organization to the business, right? And so we were mostly in charge of, planning and what we call performance management. So profitability reviews, right? Analysis when we talk about, our underwriting actions and tactics. Are they working? How do we reflect them in our projections? How do we reflect them in our plan? But also, we were seen as the conduit for when the business had a problem, we cohesively organized the actuarial function, right, to address them. We were very much generalists in that way, that we maybe were not responsible for the actual predictive model or the actual reserve review, but we could very much collaborate with our actuarial colleagues to get a solution in place for whatever the unique business challenge. Again, that was really great because it gave me, again, very lateral insight into the organization, into the challenges, and it was an actuarial role, but also a people role, a relationship role, right? And what I learned there, and what I hope my team learned there, is that your actuarial output, right, is the success of your actuarial output or opinion to be adopted is really incumbent on this engagement that you have with the business leader, right? So as a content creator, I'm sure you understand the power of engagement, right?
Yeah.
But it's really making sure that the businesses that you understand the specificity of the businesses, right? You understand and have empathy, right, for the actions that they're taking. And whether or not you can directly reflect that in your work, this exchange of information, right? You make sure you articulate, the actuaries are articulating, the thought process of where they're putting through analysis. And again, we may or may not get to a point where we agree. A lot of times we don't, right? It's not of the actuarial profession's core principles to agree with the business, right? We have our independent objective opinion, but the more you understand what the businesses are doing, the trends that they're facing, right? I think the better quality your actuarial opinion is. Yeah. So that was a great role. And then, I think it was a natural, again, very organically, I moved there from an even broader view, which is I was head of finance for our middle markets business unit. And that was my, kind of change during COVID. It was a lot of changes, right? I was kind of working out of my dining room for those couple of years, learning about, the business unit who I had supported from an actuarial perspective, but expanding my role from, to finance and broadening it, right? And so from there, I would say that a couple of things I took out from that. One is just this ability to kind of up the game in terms of strategically leading an organization, right? Which is more than just sort of tactically, the blocking, the tackling of, how do we resolve this account issue? How do we look at these changes in loss ratios? But our overarching, where are we headed strategically? How do we distill that into tactics? How do we measure the success of that tactics in terms of performance, right? The other thing I learned is that, and I think, your audience will relate to this too, is that when you're a part of a senior leadership team or an executive team, right, there's typically a chief actuary, CFO, chief underwriting officer, right? If we're talking about sort of typical insurance executives, right, heads of the business. But when you're at that senior level, there is a lot of, you have to have this ability to kind of step out of maybe your typical tactical remit, right? And think on the behalf of the enterprise, right? And so in ways, then there should be friendly collaboration, similarities, right, of output with a chief actuary and a chief underwriting officer, right, with a chief actuary and a CFO, right? In terms of when you're looking at the highest kind of level of portfolio management, these are shared activities, right? And my view is that the more overlap, right? I won't say duplication, the more overlap at this highest level of understanding our business, the more we can complement each other and look out for the enterprise. So those are kind of like my non-standard roles that eventually led to my most recent role as Chief Risk Officer.
Oh, thank you for that overview. That helps a lot. One natural follow-up I have is, did you choose a path or did the path choose you? And just to give you some context on that question,
yeah,
I'm sure we all know, well, certainly I have colleagues who maybe they do one line of business and they kind of fall in love with it. They become passionate about it. They want to drill 100 or 1,000 feet deep. For instance,
So
yeah,
I will
go ahead.
say it's a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit of both. I mean, I think as I was going through the exams, right, and working on um, thinking about, what kind of actuary I wanted to be, right? At the time, it was very like, do I want to be a reserving actuary or do I want to be a pricing actuary? I was really fortunate to have a lot of mentors, sponsors, and just friends and colleagues, right? That help me really not only ideate on the different types of opportunities, but to drive that self awareness, right? I think um, a lot of times, in my case, right, as a student, as an actuary who was embarking on their career, it was more about what could I be instead of what do I want to be, right? Um, and I say this jokingly. So I had in my like very first sort of, we call them IDPs, like individual development plans, right? Probably for the first, I don't know, 7 years of my career, I had written like learn VBA, right? Um, learn VBA, and I never learned VBA because I had actually very little interest in learning VBA, but I put it in there just because I thought, oh, everybody else, I'm looking around, every other analyst has learned VBA on there. I like maybe eventually worked out how to record a macro, right? But through the years though of self-awareness and and talking to lots of different people who had different career paths, I realized that what I'm interested in are sort of broad strategic questions, right? How do we accomplish something as a team, right? How does the actuarial output really become relevant, right? And I'm in even though when I was in finance and in this current role, I'm still thinking about, um, where I see actuarial science as just a really rich place of data, metrics, insights, right? And how do we really elevate those insights that it provides the tactical ammunition, right, for us to do what we want to do? So I think organically, those were the questions that I was drawn to, right? And so the path kind of chose me in that way, in that um, again, I kind of first learned about the process, and then I spent a lot of time on the people, and and now sort of strategy and risk overall. But
Uh,
my
Go ahead.
advice
Mhm.
to the student is don't just put something on your IDP because everybody else does. You'll never follow through with it. I still don't know VBA.
I was laughing during your response because I feel like we're aligned in the sense that I certainly have gravitated towards the more broader strategic kind of projects and
Mhm,
roles
mhm.
as well. But as a part of the leadership development program that I was in my first company, I was in a role where I had to do VBA probably every day for 2 years. And in all honesty, it definitely was not my strongest role. But I think it's good. One thing I'll add, if I could piggyback on to some of the advice
Yeah,
you're providing, is that sometimes it's not the worst thing in the world to do a role that has an end date. That's something that you're not
mhm,
naturally as strong at, because
mhm.
in my mind, there's nothing more powerful than knowing for certain that this is something that you don't want to do.
You don't, yeah,
When it's
absolutely.
theoretical and it's like, okay, well,
Yeah,
yeah, like
yeah,
you said, everyone knows this, so maybe I need to do that. But when you do it and you
yeah,
realize, okay, I was right. This is probably not what I want to do. I
yeah,
think that can be very powerful as well.
yeah.
So
And
yeah.
to that point, Dominic, like I still remember, so when I was a CNA, we had this student rotation program, right? Every 16 months, 18 months we would rotate. And I'm one where I have certainly had the privilege of having a lot of different roles in my career, right? And I remember at the time, not only did I have VBA on my IDP, but I always also just really um, just scrutinized my options and, my next steps as if like these were really permanent decisions, right? I would agonize over, oh, how do I rank these next 3 job opportunities, these next 3 rotations? If I don't get this rotation, like it was as if the world would collapse, right? And it didn't. I didn't always get my first choice, and it always worked out. And now, in hindsight, probably because I'm so old, I don't even remember, some of those roles, right, that I had agonized over, right? So to your point, it's not career ending to discover that you're in a place that you may not enjoy, and what you see as like really big deviations from your original sort of intention might not be as consequential as at that point in time.
I couldn't agree more. And another point of irony is that you talked about rotations and ones that you might have wanted and never got. So one that I'll just be open about it. I wanted several. I applied for it at least twice. Is enterprise risk management, and never got it. Certainly, I thought would have been interesting. But to your point, sometimes your path just takes you on, or your career takes you on a different path. But speaking of ERM, I think that's a nice glue to the next question.
Yeah.
Is you're now the chief risk officer at Zurich, which I think is sounds like a very interesting role. So what are your key responsibilities in this role?
Yeah. So I was, really excited to start on this role, and I told my mom, and I said, Mom, I'm starting a new job, and she doesn't know it. I mean, so I grew up in Michigan, where my dad's an engineer. He was at Ford Motor Company for 30 years, right? So we are a pretty sort of linear family in terms of like, what is a job, right? Like people. And so I said, I'm starting a new role. I'm not going to be an actuary anymore. I'm not going to be head of finance, but I'm going to go into risk management. And she was like, isn't that what you've been doing this whole time, is just risk management? Right? So she's like, what does that even mean? And so like when people think about CR roles, right, that could mean a lot of different things. The way I think about it is it's my responsibility, right, to help Zurich manage and mitigate its risks. And that incorporates a lot of things I'll talk about, as Zurich is helping our customers, right, manage their risk in their operations, right? And so there are things that are part of, so there's ERM, right, enterprise risk management, and those are things that we do where we look at the different pressures and elevations of our risk, what we call our risk taxonomy, right? So that's like the general vocab words that everybody hears about, like reputational risk, financial risk, insurance risks, like regulatory risks, political risks, et cetera, right? And we have an exercise where our team does, which is we profile the different units and the different functions in terms of, where does their risk landscape lie, and how do we mitigate and manage that, right? Catastrophe risk, environmental risk, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's one big piece, right? Is really just understanding the explicit risk that we face, and also the implicit risk that we all take to function as any corporation. As part of that, right, my team also manages our internal control framework, right? So you have a risk, you have actions that you mitigate that, right? And we document that in terms of controls and mitigation actions. And there is a quarterly process where we, not only sign off, where our enterprise signs off, and we test those controls for efficiency. Yeah. And then, I also have a team of risk partners, again, associated with each business unit, that understands the complexity, the specificity of that business unit and their risk profile. And then lastly, and certainly I'm sure I'm missing key components here, is I manage the purchase of insurance on behalf of Zurich, right? So just as insurance is a key risk mitigation tool for our customers, right, and our financial systems, our environment, we also, Zurich as a company, purchases insurance to protect ourselves.
And that's a fascinating thing I found. There's only one time early in my career I remember hearing an insurance company talking about purchasing insurance for themselves. So would you say there's any fundamental differences in the thought process when you're managing the risks that you're assuming from clients versus whether it's individuals or businesses versus when you're purchasing insurance on behalf of Zurich? Is there any fundamental differences there?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it from a couple of different perspectives, right? So, from a personal level, right? Personally, actually, my husband buys insurance for us. You think I would do that, but no, he does that, and he also like fills out our tax forms and things like that. So it's very like conceptually similar, right? So we kind of think through, okay, we have a building, we have 2 cars, we have 3 kids, and we have a tail event, right? Like what if something catastrophic happens to the both of us? Like what, who would take care of our kids so there's different products, right? That helps with that. Just like in P&C insurance, right? So, at Zurich, we offer some type of insurance for 95% of the Fortune 100, Fortune 500, right? So our customers have very similar risk profiles and needs that we do, right? So we have a real estate portfolio that we need protection on, right? We have employees that need protection from a workers' compensation perspective. We have a motor fleet, right? And so those are some of the tangible things, right? But in terms of risk management in emerging risks, right? We're faced with social inflation, just like our customers are faced with social inflation, with climate change, right? And so I very much, right, seek to purchase the appropriate insurance to cover that. And similarly to our customers, our large customers, there are arrangements locally, right, for Zurich North America, as well as insurance arrangements with our group or with our parent company, Zurich Insurance Group, right? And sometimes we have coverage that falls under their umbrella, and sometimes we have coverage that we purchase independently.
So this sounds like a really exciting role. I think when I think of an enterprise role, there's so much going on. You get to see the full 360 picture. What would you say is the most exciting part of your role as Chief Risk Officer?
So this sounds cliche, but like every day is different, which is really exciting, right? Some days I'm working on a capital question. Some days I'm working on a regulatory question, right? And I think it's one of those roles where, I'm learning every day, and it requires a sense of curiosity about the enterprise, right? That really fuels me, and about challenging the status quo, right? Because I think, again, we are all naturally gravitate towards the explicit risks, right? We can all kind of sit down and think about all these risks that we are taking every day. But then the implicit risks, right? The risks that are embedded in our operations, in our systems, and in our environment, right? The insurance regulatory environment, in our administration, right, is one that in the business decisions that we make is really fascinating to me. So I think just as I may be familiar at this point, or I'm fairly new with something. A new challenge kind of comes around the corner, and that's been, I think, the most challenging, but also the most exciting part of my job.
Great. No, hopefully this doesn't seem like a rhetorical question, because I think there's an innate overlap between actuarial and risk management. I mean, I think you could argue risk management is a subset of what we're doing. So how did your actuarial role help to prepare you to set you up for this role?
So I think, so I'll talk about specifically, and then I'll talk about like sort of big picture, right? So specifically, there is actually quite a bit of work that we do in terms of our statutory regulatory environment, right? And I did spend quite a bit of my career as a pricing actuary, where I did rate filings, right? And I still kind of like, I hadn't thought about like the 𝗟𝗶𝘃 Act for a long time, since my exam days, but just the fact that we operate in a very state-specific environment, right? And my history doing sort of actuarial filings and working with the different bureaus and understanding how insurance is regulated has been really helpful, right? The amount of sort of understanding of required capital and capital modeling, right? And the use of financial models to work out, the parameterization of the capital is something that I lean on that knowledge every day, right? And of course, as part of insurance risk, portfolio risk, the sort of the basic pricing, reserving, portfolio analytics, right? Knowledge is part of my life too. And then lastly, the accumulation of risk, right? So it comes hand in hand. Actuaries, we quantify risk, right? And then of course it goes into risk accumulation. So how do we manage our risk accumulations and catastrophes in cyber, right? And how does that hit up against our the profile that and our threshold that we accept, right? The quantification of something that is of risk is something I use every day. But I think ultimately, from a big picture perspective, just the ability to sort of connect the dots, right? In either a risk landscape, right? Or in any sort of analysis where you can see there's thematically commonalities in the data, right? And the way that through time, certain things emerge and moderate, right? Just that ability to pull themes, seam through data and analytics has really provided me a great foundation for what I'm doing today.
That makes sense then, and it's not just for the audience. It's not uncommon for an actuary to be a chief risk officer. I've certainly seen that in the past, so I think it seems like a natural fit. And I think what you said just corroborated that. Now, something that we're both, hopefully you're okay with me saying this, you appear to be passionate about the actuarial profession. Certainly, that's something that helps to drive what we're doing forward with this mission and Sprand. Now, the profession itself has been, I think, under the microscope in the past few years. And not to say that only the actuarial profession, but there's been lots of changes in the environment.
Yes.
But so before we get into those, what some of those are, like, what are your views on the actuarial profession today?
So I think the actuarial profession, as with any other profession, right? I agree, has gone through a lot of change, has evolved, right? Has enriched and has deepened in our knowledge, right? I think just the amount of education that the CAS does, right, and the SOA does in preparing us, right? Not only in the sort of the syllabus, but also in the continuing education, right? In the conversations we have quote unquote built much more capable, better actuaries, right? And I think the resilience of the profession through ebbs and, I remember a time like, maybe 10 years ago, it was like, big data scientists, right? We're gonna sort of eliminate the actuarial jobs, right? Or like, at one point it was maybe statisticians were going to, or like DFAs and CFAs, right? We're going to do that. But the actual profession has withstood, right, the kind of the test of time. Not only because I think the CAS and SOA through the exams have kind of protected our and provided a baseline, right, of capability, but also because of the actuaries and our ability to think holistically, to think strategically, right? And so I think the next wave of conversation is will, just like with a lot of other professions, will AI, right, replace actuaries, right? And I think, as I think about the future of actuaries, I think AI, just like any other tool, right, will replace some of the grunt work, right, of actuaries, but we need to leverage that saving of time for more insightful work, right? That's where the comparative advantage, right, of actuaries lie, is our ability to translate our actuarial opinion, right, into strategic insights.
Interestingly enough, I mean, that question comes up all the time, and in my Instagram community, I do Q&A probably weekly or bi-weekly sometimes. And someone asked what's the consensus on actuarial jobs given AI is moving full steam ahead. And I usually answer, I mean, my answer is usually consistent, but the first thing I say is, if the bulk of what you're doing is, if it's mechanical, if it's repeatable, and if it's automatable, and it comes down to the value that you bring to any situation. So if you're not adding any contextual insights, if what you're doing is primarily the things you mentioned, then what I say is that there's a higher likelihood that your job could be automated. But the second thing I say to that, which I think people often overlook, is that we're in the business, especially being in more of the services business, we're not in the manufacturing business, we're more in the services business. So I genuinely believe that people want to do business with other people. I don't think that people want to do business with robots, or, I mean, at least in the services space, we're not. I saw something on the news recently where for some of the higher hazard manufacturing professions, where you're like cutting up meat, they're using robots to do some of that stuff where they can't source talent like that. There's some areas where AI makes sense. But I think in the services industry, of course, I always say this before I answer the question, is there's always a risk of obsolescence. There's always a risk of jobs going away. I mean, at the end of the day, we're human, and decisions are made for different reasons. But I just like to think of it in terms of likelihood and based on the value that you're bringing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I may be biased, as you can see through kind of my background. I think that the more you really understand the business, right? It's the insurance is not the squaring of the triangles, right? The more the actuaries can understand, or the underwriter understands the actual product, right? Not just sort of the data that is accumulated through the purchase and the claims that are incurred, right? Not just that data that is accumulated from the output, but the actual product, what it's designed to do, the people who underwrite the process, the customers who purchase the product, right? The more we actually understand the business of insurance, right, then that's not replaceable by a computer or a machine, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And in light of these changes and in light of the profession being put under the microscope, like, what do you think are the most important considerations for actuaries in navigating their careers today? I think you just alluded to one. One of the things that you mentioned in your previous conversation, which I thought was great. I like the use of the term higher value skills. So learning the business, I think of as one of those. So whether it's higher value skills, competencies, or something else, what are some of those considerations for actuarial students, experienced actuaries as they move forward?
Yeah, I think for me is really thinking strategically, thinking holistically, right? Thinking sort of um, understanding that your objectives are maybe well defined, but always looking out sort of for the enterprise, right? And don't be afraid to challenge, right? Our profession is changing, our industry is changing very, very quickly, right? Just because somebody used to do it some way, even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, does not mean that a newer way of thinking and rationalizing and understanding a process can be improved, right? And again, the actual insurance is a very old industry, right? Um, and and the essence of insurance, right, is irreplaceable. So really understanding the product, the utility of the product is the most important, in my opinion.
A couple of things that you mentioned before, too, which I thought were just really good, is you talked about breadth, not limiting ourselves to actuarial, which I think you've exemplified in your career. You talked about finance and risk. And another thing is engaging with business partners outside of producing the standard actuarial analysis. I can certainly relate to that in my careers. A lot of what I've learned of insurance is working with underwriters and other business partners. So I think those two to me I think are really good tips that I guess I'll add to what you previously said. Now, can I take that a step further? You being a C-suite leader now, you have a unique lens into the mindset of what makes an effective leader. So as actuaries progress in their careers and they're starting to look at, more of the senior level positions, how do you think through, what would be an ideal mindset for someone who's breaking into more a senior level position and it's not necessarily limited to an actuarial role, but as you go to something more senior, how do you think of that, that mindset and how that mindset evolves?
Yeah, so this is something that again, I'll kind of go back to what I said earlier, right? Is um, when we're moving from individual contributor to manager, right, to leader, I think of those as maybe kind of three fairly distinct times in our career, right? Not necessarily linear escalation, but we all have different roles. And we sometimes very much equate a manager and a leader, right, in the same way because their activities are very similar. They may manage larger teams, right? But I think the difference between a leader and a manager is that the manager manages within their remit, right? Whereas a leader looks out for the enterprise, right? And so you can have a individual contributor who doesn't not directly actively manage people, right? But have that leadership mindset, right? And and again, at the very senior levels, it's not about us kind of looking down. I'm not just looking down at my risk piece, right? Our chief underwriting officer, our CFO is not just looking at the underwriting and the finance piece. If we simply look down internally into our hierarchy, then the enterprise fails, right? And so, again, I think being that leader, you have to have an enterprise mindset, be highly collaborative, and really constantly challenge, right, yourself and your team to do the same. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can't think of a better way to wrap up the conversation. I really learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with the community. I'm sure lots of people will glean very valuable insights from this. And again, want to thank you for your time, and as always, let's continue to keep in touch.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I feel like this is like one of I've made it in terms of an actuary because I've come on this podcast. So you do great work, Dominic, and I'm happy to be here and support you in any way.
I'm very humble and very happy to add you to the pantheon of guests on Live with the Maverick. All right. Thank you, Anne. Have a wonderful evening.